A man sits in the corner of a grand wedding hall, his fingers moving over the keys of a grand piano. He is a shadow in the glittering light, a quiet presence meant to be heard but not seen. He is dressed simply in a clean but unremarkable suit. To the hundreds of guests, sipping champagne and laughing under crystal chandeliers, he is just the help. A musician, hired for the night. The bride, a vision in white, storms towards him. Her face, meant to be a portrait of joy, is twisted into a mask of pure fury. She stops before the piano, and in the sudden silence her voice is a whip crack. She accuses him of playing the wrong songs, of ruining her perfect day. What no one in that room knows is that the man she is humiliating is not just a musician. He is a millionaire CEO. He is a titan of industry, and he is the groom's own brother. Before this night is over, that bride's perfect world will not just be ruined, it will be utterly destroyed. Jaws will drop, her future will collapse, and the so-called nobody at the piano will be the one holding all the power. Before we find out what happens next, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story is already hitting home, hit that like button. The wedding reception of Amber Whitfield and Daniel Johnson was an exercise in excess. The ballroom of the city's most exclusive hotel was bathed in the warm golden light of a dozen chandeliers, each one dripping with thousands of crystals that scattered the light like diamonds. Tables were draped in heavy white linen, adorned with towering floral arrangements of orchids and roses that perfumed the air with a sweet, cloying scent. Guests, a curated collection of the city's elite, moved through the room with practiced grace, their laughter mixing with the clinking of champagne flutes. In the corner, almost an afterthought, sat Marcus Johnson at a polished black grand piano. He was playing a soft, soulful jazz tune, a gentle melody that wove through the din of conversation, providing a pleasant but unobtrusive backdrop to the celebration. His eyes were closed, his body swaying slightly with the rhythm. He was lost in the music, a place of peace in the midst of overwhelming opulence. That peace was shattered by the sharp, angry tap of a stiletto on the marble floor. Marcus opened his eyes. Standing before him was the bride, Amber. Her dress was a magnificent creation of silk and lace, a cloud of white that should have made her look angelic. But there was nothing angelic about the expression on her face. Her perfectly made-up features were tight with rage, her blue eyes cold and hard. Her new husband, Daniel, stood a few paces behind her, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Excuse me," Amber snapped, her voice cutting through the nearby chatter. A small circle of silence formed around them as guests turned to watch. "What do you think you're doing?" Marcus's fingers stilled on the keys. He looked at her, his expression calm and unreadable. "I'm playing the piano, ma'am." Amber let out a short, derisive laugh. It was a sound like breaking glass. "I can see that. But you're playing the wrong thing. This isn't some back-alley bar. This is my wedding. We paid for classical music, for elegance. Not this noise." She gestured dismissively at the piano as if it were a piece of garbage. A murmur went through the nearby guests. Some looked shocked, others amused. This was drama, and it was far more interesting than small talk about the stock market. Marcus remained silent, his hands resting lightly on the ivory keys. He had agreed to play this wedding as a favor to his brother Daniel. He had agreed to keep a low profile, to just be the musician. He hadn't expected this. Amber took his silence as a sign of stupidity or defiance, and it only fueled her anger. "Are you tone deaf?" she demanded, her voice rising in volume. "I have a specific playlist. You were given a list. This sad, depressing music is ruining the atmosphere. You are ruining my wedding." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and ugly. The word ruining was a dagger she wielded with glee. She wanted to hurt him. She wanted to make an example of him. He was a nameless, faceless servant. And he had dared to displease her on her most important day. The manager of the hotel was already scurrying over, his face a mask of panicked apology. "Is there a problem, Mrs. Johnson?" the manager asked, his eyes darting nervously from Amber's furious face to Marcus's calm one. "Yes, there's a problem," Amber seethed. "This nobody musician is refusing to play the music we requested. He's deliberately trying to spoil my reception." She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at Marcus. Her diamond ring, a gift paid for by the Johnson family fortune, flashed under the lights. "I want him out of here. Now. Get security and remove him." The humiliation was complete. She had called him a nobody. She had demanded his forcible removal in front of hundreds of people. Some of the guests, friends of Amber's from her social circle, laughed openly now. They saw it as Amber being her usual assertive self, putting the help in their place. But others looked on with a sense of deep unease. The cruelty was so naked, so unnecessary. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't get angry. He simply looked past Amber, his gaze finding his brother Daniel, who was standing frozen by a pillar. The narrator's voice would later explain the truth that hung in that silent moment. Amber thought she was mocking a hired janitor of music, a low-wage worker who had overstepped his bounds. But she was mocking a millionaire who had built a tech empire from the ground up. She was mocking a man who, through a series of shell corporations and holding companies, owned nearly half of the very building they were standing in. She was mocking the silent foundational source of the wealth she had just so gleefully married into. And her life, as she knew it, was about to end. As Amber's cruel words echoed in the suddenly quiet ballroom, every eye turned to one man, Daniel Johnson, the groom. He was trapped in the spotlight, a deer caught in the blinding headlights of his new wife's fury. His face was pale, the color drained away, leaving his skin looking like parchment. His mouth was slightly open, as if he wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the words were stuck in his throat. He was a man torn in two. On one side was Amber, his bride of only a few hours, a beautiful, fiery woman he thought he loved. She was demanding loyalty, demanding that he stand with her against this perceived insult from a hired hand. On the other side was the man at the piano, his brother. Daniel's mind was a whirlwind of panic and shame. He remembered the phone call from a few weeks ago, begging Marcus to do this for him. "Please, Mark," he had said, his voice pleading. "It would mean the world to me. Just play for a couple of hours. Amber, she's got this whole image thing. If my billionaire brother is playing the piano, it becomes the Marcus Johnson show. I just want it to be our day." Marcus, ever the generous older brother, had agreed without hesitation. He had promised to be discreet, to just be a musician for the night, and Daniel had let him. He had allowed his brother to be placed in this vulnerable position, all to appease Amber's obsession with appearances. Now that obsession had curdled into public cruelty. Daniel could feel the weight of hundreds of pairs of eyes on him. They were waiting. The guests, the hotel staff, his own family members scattered throughout the crowd. They were all waiting to see what the groom would do. Would he defend the musician, or would he stand by his bride? It should have been an easy choice. He should have walked over, put a hand on Amber's arm, and calmly de-escalated the situation. He should have said, "Amber, darling, let's not make a scene. He's with me." But he did nothing. Fear held him in place. Fear of Amber's temper, which he knew could be volcanic. Fear of ruining the wedding day he had spent a fortune on. Fear of the argument that would inevitably follow, the days of icy silence and bitter recriminations. And so he remained frozen, his silence a gaping void in the heart of the conflict. Amber saw his stillness, and in her arrogance, she completely misinterpreted it. She saw his silence not as paralysis, but as endorsement. She thought he was letting her handle it, that he approved of her taking charge. A triumphant smirk touched her lips. She turned her head slightly, giving him a look that said, "See? I've got this." The gloating in that small gesture was immense. She felt powerful, validated. Her new husband was on her side. Across the room, Marcus watched his brother. His calm expression didn't waver, but his eyes held a deep, profound disappointment. He wasn't angry at Amber. He expected nothing more from her. He had seen her true colors long ago. It was Daniel's silence that cut him. Yet even in that moment of betrayal, Marcus offered a lifeline. He gave Daniel a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was a look that conveyed a complex message across the crowded room. It said, "I see you. I understand you're trapped, but this is not the time or the place. Stay quiet. Not yet." It was a moment of grace, a signal that Marcus was still in control, that a larger plan was at work. Daniel, in his panicked state, barely registered the subtlety. All he felt was a wave of relief that his brother wasn't shouting back, wasn't making the scene even worse. The tension in the room grew thick and suffocating. The guests shifted uncomfortably. The injustice was a physical thing, a sour taste in their mouths. They had just witnessed a public shaming, and the groom, the one man who could have stopped it, had chosen to do nothing. He had chosen silence. And in that moment, Daniel Johnson's silence was the loudest sound in the room, a deafening confirmation of his weakness and a green light for the cruelty to continue. The manager, taking his cue from the groom's inaction, finally spoke to Marcus, his voice low and apologetic. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Marcus simply nodded once, rose from the piano bench, and walked away without a single word. To understand the glacier-like calm of Marcus Johnson as he was being humiliated, one had to understand who he truly was. And to understand that, you had to go back a few weeks to a conversation that took place in a penthouse office overlooking the city. The man at the piano was not a struggling musician. He was Marcus Johnson, the founder and CEO of Innovate Dynamics, a tech conglomerate that was quietly changing the world. He was a self-made billionaire, a prodigy who had written his first revolutionary piece of code at 16 and built an empire by the time he was 30. His name was whispered with reverence in Silicon Valley and on Wall Street. His face had been on the cover of Forbes and Time. He was a giant of industry, a man whose decisions could create or destroy fortunes. But there was another side to Marcus, a side the business world rarely saw. He was a classically trained pianist and a celebrated jazz musician. Music was not his job, it was his soul. He owned a small, exclusive jazz club downtown, where he would sometimes play unannounced, not for money, but for the sheer love of it. It was his escape, his connection to something more real than stock prices and quarterly reports. His younger brother, Daniel, worked for him. Daniel was a vice president at Innovate Dynamics, a position Marcus had given him, along with a generous salary and stock options that had already made him a multimillionaire. Daniel was smart and capable, but he lived in the shadow of his brother's colossal success, and he was acutely aware of it. That awareness was at the heart of the conversation they had a month before the wedding. Daniel had come to Marcus's office looking nervous. "Mark," he began, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, "I have a huge favor to ask." Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, a warm smile on his face. "Anything, Danny. You know that. What's up?" "It's about the wedding," Daniel said, avoiding his brother's eyes. "The musician we hired for the reception just canceled. Medical emergency. We're scrambling to find a replacement, and Amber is... well, she's freaking out." "I can make some calls," Marcus offered immediately. "I know the best musicians in the country. I can have someone there tomorrow." "That's the thing," Daniel said, finally looking up. I was hoping you would do it." Marcus was taken aback. "Me? Danny, you know I'd do anything for you, but are you sure? It's your wedding. It might seem a little odd." "No, that's exactly what I want," Daniel insisted, his words coming out in a rush. "But here's the favor. Can you just be the piano player? Not Marcus Johnson, CEO. Not my famous brother, just a musician. We'll pay you the standard fee. List you on the program as Mr. Johnson. No one needs to know. Marcus frowned, confused. Why would you want that? Daniel's face flushed with a mixture of shame and honesty. It's Amber, he admitted. She's obsessed with this wedding being perfect. She wants to be the star. She wants me to be the star. If you're there as you, everyone will be talking about you. It'll become the Marcus Johnson wedding. She'll feel overshadowed. I'll feel overshadowed. Please, Mark, just for one night. Can you just do this for me? Keep it humble. It would mean everything to me. Marcus looked at his younger brother and his heart went out to him. He saw the insecurity, the desperate need to feel like his own man, especially on his wedding day. He saw how deeply Daniel was entangled in Amber's need for control and status. Against his better judgment, Marcus agreed. Love for his brother outweighed the absurdity of the request. All right, Danny, he said softly, if that's what you want. For you, I'll be the invisible man. And so, the plan was set. On the day of the wedding, Marcus Johnson, a man who typically wore $10,000 bespoke suits, put on a simple off-the-rack outfit. He left his Patek Philippe watch, worth more than most cars, in a drawer at home. He drove himself to the hotel in a nondescript sedan instead of his usual Aston Martin. He entered through a service entrance, just as the other vendors did. He had transformed himself from a giant into a ghost, all for the love of his brother. Now the audience, armed with this secret knowledge, was in on the game. They were co-conspirators in the quiet, patient revenge that was about to unfold. They knew that the man who had just been dismissed like a piece of trash held all the cards, and he was just waiting for the right moment to play his hand. In the bustling chaos of a high-end wedding reception, the staff are trained to be invisible. They are ghosts in crisp uniforms, gliding between tables, refilling glasses, clearing plates, their movements efficient and silent. They see everything and say nothing. One of these ghosts was a young woman named Lily Perez. Lily was a college student working 2 jobs to pay her tuition. She was smart, observant, and had a strong sense of right and wrong, a moral compass that hadn't yet been dulled by the cynicism of the world. From her post near the kitchen doors, she had a clear view of the piano, and she had witnessed the entire ugly confrontation. While the wealthy guests saw Marcus as part of the decor, Lily had noticed him from the start. She had heard the soul in his music, a depth and passion that was a stark contrast to the superficial chatter that filled the room. She saw the way his fingers moved with a lover's familiarity over the keys. She didn't know who he was, but she knew he was a true artist. When Amber had stormed over, Lily's stomach had tightened into a knot. She had seen Amber's type before, the entitled, wealthy patrons who treated service staff like furniture that could talk. She watched as the bride's words, sharp and venomous, cut through the air. She saw the sneers on the faces of Amber's friends. She saw the groom, Daniel, standing paralyzed and useless. And she saw the quiet, unshakable dignity of the man at the piano. While others felt awkwardness or amusement, Lily felt a hot surge of anger. It was profoundly unfair. After Marcus was dismissed and walked away from the piano, his path took him past the service station where Lily was standing. His face was a mask of calm, but Lily could see the hurt lingering in his eyes. He hadn't fought back. He hadn't argued. He had simply absorbed the humiliation with a grace that made Amber's tantrum seem even more childish and grotesque. As he drew near, Lily made a split-second decision. Her job, her much-needed paycheck, depended on her staying invisible, on never interacting with the guests unless spoken to. But her conscience wouldn't let her stay silent. As Marcus passed, she took a half-step forward, making sure no managers were watching. "Sir?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Marcus stopped and looked at her. He seemed surprised that anyone was speaking to him. "I just want to say I'm so sorry," Lily said, her words tumbling out in a quiet rush. "What she did, that was horrible. Your music was beautiful. Truly." For the first time that night, A genuine warmth entered Marcus's eyes. He saw in this young waitress a flicker of human decency that had been so absent elsewhere in the room. He gave her a small, grateful smile. "Thank you. That means a lot." But Lily wasn't finished. In her hand, she had been clutching a small, folded cocktail napkin. On it, she had scribbled a few words with a pen she kept in her apron pocket. It was an impulsive gesture, a small act of solidarity. She pushed it discreetly into his hand. "Here," she whispered. I wanted you to know." Marcus looked down at his hand, then back at her. He nodded his thanks, a silent acknowledgement of her kindness, and then continued on his way toward the exit. Once he was in the quiet solitude of the marble-floored corridor, he unfolded the napkin. Written in neat, hurried script were 5 simple words. "You don't deserve this." Marcus stared at the note. In the grand scheme of his life, this was a small thing, a note from a waitress he would likely never see again. But in that moment, it felt monumental. It was a reminder that even in a room full of performative wealth and ugly arrogance, kindness could still exist. Lily Perez had no idea who she had just offended. She didn't know he was a millionaire, or that he held the fate of the bride and groom in his hands. She had defended him simply because she believed it was the right thing to do. She had cemented her role as the story's moral compass. And Marcus Johnson was a man who never forgot an act of courage, no matter how small. That little note was now a piece of evidence, and Lily, the waitress who saw everything, had just become a key witness in a trial she didn't even know was coming. Back in the main ballroom, the brief, ugly drama was over, and the carefully curated atmosphere of celebration was being hastily restored. The orchestra struck up a lively classical piece, a little too loud, a little too cheerful, as if trying to scrub the memory of the confrontation from the air. For Amber, the incident was already a victory. She felt a rush of adrenaline, the triumphant thrill of having asserted her dominance. She glided over to her bridesmaids, who were gathered near the towering wedding cake, their faces a mixture of feigned shock and genuine amusement. "Can you believe the nerve of that man?" Amber said, plucking a fresh flute of champagne from a passing tray. She took a delicate sip, her eyes sparkling with self-satisfaction. "Honestly, a janitor with a piano, thinking he could play that depressing trash at my wedding." Her friends giggled, their laughter a chorus of sycophantic approval. "You totally put him in his place, Amber," one of them said, a blonde in a silk dress that was a shade too tight. "He needed to be taught a lesson." "I know, right?" Amber preened. "Some people just don't understand their station in life." "He's lucky I didn't have him fired from his agency on the spot." She felt magnanimous, as if choosing not to ruin his entire livelihood was an act of great charity. In her mind, she had single-handedly saved her wedding from the brink of disaster, a disaster caused by one incompetent. Musician Daniel approached the group, his face still pale and drawn. He was holding 2 glasses of champagne, and he offered one to Amber. She took it without looking at him, her attention still focused on her audience of bridesmaids. "That was a little intense, don't you think?" Daniel said quietly, trying to steer her away from her friends. Amber rolled her eyes, turning to him with a look of pure exasperation. "Danny, don't be so soft. He was ruining the ambiance. I handled it. It's over. Everyone's already forgotten about it." But Daniel hadn't forgotten. The image of his brother's calm, disappointed face was burned into his mind. The weight of his own silence felt like a stone in his stomach. "He's just a guy trying to do his job, Amber." There was no need to humiliate him like that. Amber's smile vanished, replaced by a flash of irritation. His job was to follow a playlist, and he failed. "This is our wedding, the most important day of our lives. I'm not going to let some minimum-wage musician spoil it because he has an artistic ego." She put a hand on his chest, her touch meant to be reassuring, but feeling more like a warning. "Listen to me. We are going to have the most amazing night. And on Monday, when we're on our way to Bora Bora, you are going to call his booking agency and make sure he gets a formal reprimand. And if he doesn't personally write me a letter of apology, I want you to have him fired." Daniel stared at her, horrified. A letter of apology? Fired? The absurdity of it was staggering. He opened his mouth to argue, to try and explain how insane her demand was, but he couldn't find the words. He couldn't bring himself to say, "Amber, that man is my brother. He's the reason we can afford this wedding, the trip to Bora Bora, the house we're moving into." The lie had gone on too long. It had taken root, and now admitting the truth felt impossible. It would unravel everything. Seeing his hesitation, Amber's face hardened. "Don't tell me you feel sorry for him," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "After he tried to ruin our day? You need to be on my side, Daniel. My side. Always." She didn't wait for an answer. She simply turned, raised her glass in a toast to her friends, and took a long, triumphant drink. She was the queen of her perfect castle, basking in the glow of her victory. She had no idea that the man she had just banished, the janitor she wanted fired, was at that very moment standing outside, calmly dismantling her entire kingdom with a single phone call. Her victory lap was a dance on the edge of a cliff, and she was about to be pushed over the edge. Marcus Johnson did not storm out of the hotel. He did not slam any doors or curse under his breath. He walked calmly through the opulent lobby, past the smiling bellhops and the concierge desk, his face a mask of serene neutrality. He pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the cool night air. The sounds of the city, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of traffic, the murmur of pedestrians, were a welcome relief after the stuffy, artificial atmosphere of the reception. He walked to the edge of the curb, loosened his tie, and took a deep, cleansing breath. He wasn't angry. Anger was a hot, messy emotion. And Marcus was a man who preferred the cold, clean precision of logic and strategy. What he felt was a profound sense of clarity. For months he had harbored doubts about Amber. He had seen the way she treated waiters and valet attendants. He had noticed her subtle and sometimes not so subtle condescension towards people she deemed beneath her. He had warned Daniel gently at first, then more directly, that a person's true character is revealed in how they treat those who can do nothing for them. Daniel, blinded by love or perhaps by Amber's beauty and social connections, had always dismissed his concerns. "You just don't know her like I do, Mark," he would say. "She's just stressed." Tonight, Amber had shown her true character on the grandest possible stage. And his brother, his own flesh and blood, had stood by and watched it happen. The disrespect towards him was one thing. He could handle that. But Daniel's silence was a betrayal of a different order. It showed a fundamental weakness, a willingness to sacrifice integrity for an easy life. This wasn't just about a ruined evening anymore. This was about the future of his family and the integrity of the company that bore their name. A decision had been made. A line had been crossed. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. It was a sleek, minimalist device, a prototype from his own company with military-grade encryption. He scrolled through his contacts, a list that included senators, foreign dignitaries, and some of the most powerful CEOs in the world. He stopped at a single name, Arthur. Arthur was his chief legal counsel and a man of legendary efficiency. The narrator's voice would later add a layer of gravitas to this simple action. When Marcus Johnson makes a call, things happen. Billion-dollar deals are set in motion. Governments listen. Stock markets react. His words were currency, and he spent them with extreme care. He pressed the call button. It rang only once before Arthur picked up. "Marcus?" The lawyer's voice was crisp, professional, even at this late hour. Marcus didn't waste time on pleasantries. His voice was quiet, but it carried an undeniable weight of command. "Arthur, I need you to arrange a full mandatory board meeting for tomorrow morning. 10 a.m. sharp. At the main headquarters. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. A full board meeting, called with less than 12 hours' notice, was almost unheard of. It signaled a crisis of the highest order. Of course, Marcus. May I ask the agenda? The agenda is the future of this company's leadership and the Johnson Family Trust, Marcus said, his voice as cold as steel. There was a finality in his tone that left no room for questions. I want everyone there. Legal, finance, all board members, no exceptions, no excuses. It will be done, Arthur said. One more thing, Marcus added, his eyes looking up at the glittering skyscraper that housed his office, a symbol of everything he had built. Bring Daniel, and tell him to bring his fiancée. He didn't need to say her name. The instruction was precise. Then, without another word, he hung up. The call had lasted less than 30 seconds. He slid the phone back into his pocket and stood for a moment, looking at the city lights reflecting in the polished glass of the hotel. The first move had been made. The pieces were being set on the board. Amber thought she had won a small skirmish over a wedding song. She had no idea she had just declared war on a king in his own kingdom. The quiet call was a death knell for her future, and she wouldn't even hear it ringing until it was far too late. The next morning, the sun rose over a city that felt entirely different to Amber. She woke up in the lavish suite Daniel had booked for their wedding night, tangled in high-thread count sheets, a smug smile on her face. The events of the previous evening played in her mind like a highlight reel of her own power. She had faced down an impertinent staff member, asserted her authority, and her new husband had backed her up. Life was perfect. She was Mrs. Daniel Johnson now. A name that came with status, wealth, and a future of endless luxury. Her perfect morning was interrupted by a phone call to Daniel. She watched him as he listened, his face growing increasingly pale. "A board meeting?" he said, his voice tight with anxiety. "Now?" "But we're supposed to be leaving for our honeymoon." "Yes, I understand." Mandatory. He hung up the phone and turned to her, his expression grim. "What was that?" Amber asked, stretching languidly like a cat. "We have to go to my office," Daniel said, already pulling a suit from the closet. "There's an emergency board meeting." Marcus called it Amber's perfect mood, soured instantly. "A board meeting? Today? The day after our wedding? That's ridiculous. Tell him we're busy. We have a flight to catch." "You don't understand, Amber," Daniel said, his voice strained. "When Marcus calls a mandatory meeting, you go. There's no discussion. And he said for me to bring you." This piqued Amber's interest. Her irritation was replaced by a flicker of vanity. Why would the powerful, reclusive Marcus Johnson want her at a board meeting? Maybe he had heard about how she'd taken charge at the reception and was impressed by her assertiveness. Maybe he was going to formally welcome her to the family, perhaps with a generous wedding gift, a position on the board of one of their charitable foundations. The possibilities bloomed in her mind. "Well, in that case," she said, getting out of bed, "I'd better wear something appropriate." She chose a chic, expensive-looking white pantsuit, an outfit that projected an image of effortless power and sophistication. She imagined herself walking into that boardroom, the brilliant new Mrs. Johnson ready to take her rightful place in the family empire. An hour later, a black car dropped them off in front of a gleaming skyscraper of glass and steel. This was the headquarters of Innovate Dynamics, a monument to Marcus's genius. Amber had only seen it from the outside before, and she felt a thrill as she walked through the vast marble lobby. They were escorted by a silent security guard to a private elevator, which whisked them up to the top floor. The doors opened directly into a reception area furnished with minimalist art and furniture that probably cost more than her car. They were led down a long, quiet hallway and stopped in front of a pair of imposing oak doors. The guard opened them and gestured for them to enter. The room they stepped into was breathtaking. It was a massive boardroom dominated by a long, dark mahogany table that seemed to stretch for miles. One entire wall was a floor-to-ceiling window offering a panoramic, godlike view of the entire city. Seated around the table were about a dozen people, men and women dressed in impeccably tailored suits. They looked serious, powerful, and deeply intimidating. These were the directors, the investors, the top legal minds, the people who ran a billion-dollar empire. Amber's confidence faltered for a moment. The atmosphere in the room was not celebratory. It was cold, tense, and silent. Everyone turned to look at them as they entered, their expressions unreadable. There was an empty chair at the head of the table and two more on the side, clearly reserved for her and Daniel. "What is this, Daniel?" she whispered, her earlier excitement curdling into confusion and irritation. "I thought you said this was a meeting, not an interrogation. Where are the mimosas? Where's your brother?" Daniel didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was dry with dread. He knew this room well. This was where careers were made and destroyed. He guided Amber to their seats, his hand on her back feeling cold and clammy. As they sat down, the heavy oak doors at the far end of the room swung open. The time for answers had arrived. The heavy doors at the head of the boardroom swung open with a soft, authoritative whoosh. Every head in the room turned. A figure stepped through the doorway, silhouetted for a moment against the bright light of the hallway behind him. He paused, letting the silence in the room build, his presence instantly commanding the full and undivided attention of every powerful person at the table. Then he stepped forward into the light. It was Marcus Johnson. But this was not the Marcus Johnson from the wedding. The quiet, unassuming musician in the simple suit was gone. In his place stood the king in his court. He wore a bespoke charcoal gray suit that fit him like a second skin. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. He wore no tie, the top button of his crisp white shirt undone, a look of casual, confident power. He radiated an aura of absolute authority. His eyes, calm and assessing, swept across the room, acknowledging each board member with a subtle nod before finally landing on Amber. For a fraction of a second, Amber's brain refused to process what she was seeing. She stared, her mind struggling to connect the man in front of her with the nobody musician from the night before. The face was the same, but everything else, the clothes, the posture, the palpable sense of power, was completely different. Then the connection was made, and the impact was like a physical blow. A chilling stillness fell over Amber. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin a pasty, sickly white. Her perfectly applied red lipstick stood out in stark, garish contrast. Her mouth opened slightly, a small, soundless O of disbelief. The stylish clutch she had placed on the table slipped from her numb fingers and clattered onto the polished wood, the sound unnervously loud in the silent room. Recognition warred with denial, followed by a tidal wave of dawning horror. The omniscient narrator could have explained it all in that moment. The man she had mocked as a janitor of music, the man she had ordered to be thrown out, the man she had planned to have fired from his non-existent agency, was the chairman of the board of the very company that funded her entire lifestyle. He owned this room, this building, this company. He owned her husband's future. He owned her. Daniel, seeing the look on her face and knowing the moment had finally come, stood up. His legs felt shaky, but his voice, when he spoke, was clear. He had to do this. He had to finally speak the truth he should have spoken hours ago. He cleared his throat. "Amber," he said, his voice echoing in the tense silence. Everyone at the table was watching them, their faces grim. They had clearly been briefed. They knew what had happened. "Amber, I need to introduce you to someone." He gestured toward the head of the table where Marcus now stood, watching them with an unnervingly calm expression. "This is my brother," Daniel said, the words feeling both like a confession and a condemnation. "Marcus Johnson." The name, spoken aloud in this context, hung in the air like a verdict. A few quiet gasps rippled around the table from those who may not have known the full family connection. But for Amber, it was the sound of a guillotine blade dropping. The musician, the brother, the billionaire. They were all the same person. The floor seemed to fall away from beneath her, plunging her into a cold, terrifying abyss of her own making. The entire world had just been turned upside down. Down! And she was in free fall. The silence that followed Daniel's introduction was absolute and crushing. Amber sat frozen in her chair, the two words "my brother" replaying in her mind like a skipping record. It was impossible. It was a nightmare. She looked from Marcus's cold, impassive face to Daniel's pale, guilty one. And the terrible truth solidified in her gut. She had made a mistake. Not a small social blunder, but a catastrophic, life-altering error in judgment. Panic began to claw its way up her throat. She had to fix this. She had to explain. She turned her wide, pleading eyes to Marcus. I didn't know," she stammered, her voice a high, thin whisper that was nothing like her usual confident tone. "I had no idea. I thought you were just the hired help." The words sounded feeble and pathetic even to her own ears. She tried again, forcing a shaky, desperate smile. "It was all a misunderstanding." A terrible misunderstanding. Marcus remained silent, letting her words hang in the air and die. He didn't need to speak. The stern, unyielding faces of the board members spoke for him. One of them, a sharp-featured woman with silver hair and an expression of profound disapproval, was the first to break the silence. "Ignorance, Ms. Whitfield," the woman said, her voice cutting and precise, "is not an excuse for the kind of behavior you exhibited. This company and the Johnson family have a reputation to uphold. A reputation built on integrity, respect, and professionalism. Your actions were a direct contradiction of those values." Amber flinched, as if she had been slapped. She looked around the table, searching for a single sympathetic face, but found only cold, judgmental stares. These people were not her friends. They were a jury, and they had already reached a verdict. At that moment, a side door opened, and a young woman was quietly escorted into the room. It was Lily Perez, the waitress. She was dressed not in her uniform, but in a simple, neat dress. She looked nervous to be in such an imposing room, but her expression was resolute. She clutched a small napkin in her hand. Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm and level, devoid of any anger. That made it even more terrifying. It was the voice of a surgeon diagnosing a terminal illness. "Miss Whitfield, last night at my brother's wedding, you publicly humiliated a member of the staff. You referred to him as a nobody musician and a janitor of music. You accused him of ruining your wedding and demanded he be forcibly removed." He paused, letting each accusation land with devastating weight. "Is that an accurate summary of events?" Amber's mind reeled. How did he know her exact words? She looked at Lily, and a new wave of horror washed over her. The waitress. The witness. "It was a stressful situation," Amber pleaded, her voice cracking. "A bride wants her day to be perfect." I may have overreacted," Marcus gestured toward Lily. "Lily, would you mind telling the board what you saw?" Lily took a deep breath, her voice trembling slightly but clear. "I saw Mrs. Johnson. I saw her yell at him. She was cruel. She called him names. The music he was playing was beautiful, and she tore him down in front of everyone. It was wrong." She held up the napkin. "I gave him this note afterwards because I felt so bad for him." Marcus nodded. "Thank you, Lily. You may have a seat." The simple, honest testimony from a neutral observer was the final, damning piece of evidence. It stripped away all of Amber's excuses. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't bridal stress. It was a clear, unambiguous act of cruelty and arrogance. Amber's carefully constructed facade crumbled completely. The powerful, assertive bride was gone, replaced by a desperate, panicked woman who could see her entire future dissolving before her very eyes. She looked at Daniel, her eyes begging him to save her, to say something, to fix it. But Daniel just stared at the polished table, his face a mask of shame. He had remained silent last night, and he remained silent now. Her last hope was gone. The air in the boardroom was thick with a cold corporate finality. The trial was over. Now, it was time for the sentencing. Marcus stood at the head of the table, not as a brother or a musician, but as the absolute authority in the room. His gaze was fixed on Amber, but his words were addressed to the entire board, a formal declaration that would be entered into the official minutes. The Johnson family name and the reputation of Innovate Dynamics are built on a foundation of respect, he began, his voice calm and measured. We do not tolerate arrogance. We do not tolerate cruelty. We do not tolerate individuals who believe their status places them above common decency. He let the words sink in, a corporate mission statement being turned into a personal weapon. He continued, Amber Whitfield, through her public actions and her subsequent private demands to have an employee terminated without cause, has demonstrated a character that is fundamentally incompatible with the values of this family and this organization. Amber began to hyperventilate, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. This couldn't be happening. She looked at Daniel, her eyes screaming for help, but he refused to meet her gaze. He simply stared down at his hands, a statue of regret. Therefore, Marcus announced, his voice ringing with absolute power, a decision has been made. Amber Whitfield is hereby denied any and all financial ties, present or future, to the Johnson Family Trust and to Innovate Dynamics. Effective immediately. As he spoke, one of the lawyers, a man with a face like stone, slid a set of documents across the table toward Daniel. They landed in front of him with a soft, final thud. Amber could see the headings on the top page: annulment papers and revocation of prenuptial agreement benefits. It was all there, in cold, legal language. Her dream of marrying into wealth, of a life of effortless luxury, was being systematically dismantled. She was being fired. Fired from a marriage that had barely lasted 24 hours. Fired from the life she had so carefully schemed to acquire. A low murmur went through the room. A few people, perhaps business journalists Marcus had strategically invited to witness the event, discreetly raised their phones. The click of a camera shutter sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. This wasn't just a private family matter anymore. It was a public execution. Her humiliation was now complete, and it would be a matter of public record. The reality of it all finally crashed down on Amber. This was the end. There was no appeal, no negotiation. She had lost everything. A choked sob escaped her lips. She pushed her chair back violently, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. Tears streamed down her face, carving black tracks of mascara through her perfect makeup. "You can't do this," she whispered, but the words had no force, no conviction. "It's already done," Marcus replied, his voice devoid of any emotion. Amber couldn't take it anymore. She couldn't stand the sight of those cold, judging eyes. She fled. Scrambling to her feet, she ran from the room, her sobs echoing in the hallway. The heavy boardroom doors swung shut behind her, the soft click sealing her fate. The life she had dreamed of was over. The future she had been so sure of had vanished in the space of a single terrible morning. She was left with nothing but the consequences of her own arrogance. After Amber's chaotic and humiliating exit, a profound calm settled over the boardroom. The tension that had filled the air dissipated, replaced by a sense of quiet resolution. The board members began to murmur amongst themselves, gathering their papers, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock and grim satisfaction. Justice had been served, swiftly and decisively. Marcus's attention, however, was no longer on them. He turned to the person who had, in her own small way, been the catalyst for this resolution. He walked over to where Lily Perez was sitting, still looking overwhelmed by the morning's events. She had been brought here in a town car, told only that her testimony was needed for an important company matter. She had no idea she would be a key witness in the public dismantling of a rich woman's life. Marcus stopped in front of her, and the warm, gentle expression he had worn before he started playing the piano returned to his face. "Lily," he said, his voice soft. The entire room quieted, turning to watch this new interaction. Lily looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Mr. Johnson," she said nervously, "I hope I did the right thing." "You did more than the right thing, Lily," Marcus said, a genuine smile touching his lips. "You did a brave thing. In a room full of people who chose to look away, you chose to be kind. You showed integrity when it would have been much easier to stay silent. That is a quality I value more than any line on a resume." He paused, making sure he had the attention of everyone in the room, including his brother Daniel, who was now watching with a pained expression. "This company, my family, we believe in rewarding integrity. We believe in investing in people who have a strong moral compass." He looked back down at Lily. "I understand you're in college, working to pay your own way through school. Is that correct?" Lily nodded, confused as to where this was going. "Yes, sir. I'm studying business administration." "Good," Marcus said, "because as of today you don't have to worry about tuition anymore." He gestured to one of his assistants. "We are setting up a full 4-year scholarship for you at any university you choose. All tuition, books, and living expenses will be covered by the Johnson Family Foundation." A collective gasp went through the room. Lily's own breath caught in her throat. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes instantly filling with tears. But they were not tears of fear or sadness. They were tears of overwhelming, unbelievable joy. Marcus wasn't finished. "And when you graduate," he continued, his smile widening, "there will be a full-time position waiting for you here at Innovate Dynamics. A management track role, where you can put that business degree to good use. You've already proven you have the most important qualification, character." Lily was speechless. She tried to say thank you, but all that came out was a choked sob. This man, this near stranger she had shown one small moment of kindness to, had just changed the entire trajectory of her life. He had handed her a future she had only dared to dream about. The narrator would later emphasize the beautiful, perfect symmetry of the moment. Arrogance had been met with swift and public punishment. The woman who looked down on others was cast out. And in the very same room, humility and kindness were rewarded with a gift beyond measure. The moral of the story was being written in real time, a stark and unforgettable contrast. The waitress, who was meant to be invisible, was now the most important person in the room, a living testament to the fact that true power lies not in how you treat your equals, but in how you lift up those the world has taught you to ignore. The boardroom slowly emptied out. The board members, lawyers, and assistants filed out, leaving a trail of quiet, respectful nods in Marcus's direction. Soon, only 2 people were left in the vast, silent room: Marcus and Daniel. The sun was higher in the sky now, flooding the room with bright morning light that seemed to mock the dark, heavy atmosphere that lingered between the 2 brothers. The remnants of the morning's drama, the annulment papers, a hastily abandoned clutch, an overturned water glass, were stark reminders of the destruction that had taken place. Marcus walked over to a polished side cabinet and took out a heavy crystal decanter and 2 glasses. He poured a generous amount of amber-colored liquid into each one, a rare, expensive single malt whiskey. He walked back to the table and slid one of the glasses toward Daniel. He sat down, not in the chairman's seat at the head of the table, but in the chair next to his brother, a gesture of equality. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Daniel stared into his glass, swirling the whiskey, watching the light catch in the liquid. The silence was thick with unspoken words, with years of shared history and a fresh, deep wound. Finally, Daniel broke the silence, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm sorry, Marcus," he said, his gaze still fixed on the glass. He couldn't bring himself to look his brother in the eye. "I am so, so sorry. Last night, I should have spoken up. I should have stopped her. I was a coward." The confession was a painful one, an admission of his deepest failing. He had frozen, prioritizing his fear of conflict over his loyalty to his own brother. Marcus took a slow sip of his whiskey before answering. His expression was not one of anger, but of a kind of weary sadness. "Yes, you should have," he said simply. There was no condemnation in his voice, only a quiet statement of fact. I didn't know what to do," Daniel continued, his voice cracking. "I was trapped. I let it happen." "I know," Marcus said. He finally turned to look at his younger brother. "And I forgive you, Danny. You're my brother. I'll always forgive you." A wave of relief washed over Daniel. He finally looked up, his eyes full of gratitude. But Marcus held up a hand, stopping him. "But forgiveness doesn't erase the lesson," Marcus said, his voice taking on a more serious, instructive tone. "I need you to understand this, not just for my sake, but for yours. Better late than never is what people say. And yes, you eventually came here today. But you need to remember this for the rest of your life. Silence in the face of disrespect, especially to someone you love, is its own kind of betrayal. It's an endorsement. It tells the abuser that their behavior is acceptable, and it tells the victim that they are not worth defending." The words hit Daniel harder than any angry shout ever could. They were the plain, unvarnished truth. His silence had been a betrayal. Marcus raised his glass. "To new beginnings," he said, "and to learning from our mistakes." Daniel raised his own glass, his hand trembling slightly. "To learning from our mistakes," he echoed. They clinked their glasses together, the sound a small, sharp punctuation mark on a day of immense upheaval. They drank in silence, the brothers Johnson, their bond strained but not broken, forever changed by the events of the last day. Camera, the storyteller's eye, would pull back then. Out from the boardroom past the two brothers sitting together, silhouetted against the breathtaking view of the city they both, in their own ways, helped to build. They were united once more. But the lesson hung between them, a permanent part of their story. The moral was clear, ringing out over the sprawling skyline. Loyalty requires a voice. Mocking others might make you feel powerful for a moment, but true power is hidden in humility. And when arrogance meets truth, it always falls apart. If this story about dignity and justice moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one. What would you have done in this situation? Let us know below.